Hey there, guys. So in class, we just finished talking about how Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, right? April 14th of 1865. And when this happens, we talked about his vice president, Andrew Johnson. So don't mix him up and call him Andrew Jackson, okay? Andrew Johnson now becomes president. So when Johnson becomes president, once again, he is a Southerner who sided with the Union during the Civil War. And he is also going to be a Democrat. And it might seem really odd to us why Lincoln might have chosen someone like this for a vice president, right? Why on earth would they be on the same ticket? Well, think about, I don't know if you guys remember, when John McCain ran for president, he chose Sarah Palin. And at this time, John McCain was someone who was much older, right? And he chose someone who was not only younger, but a female. The whole point is pull in a demographic that you are not going to tackle yourself with whatever you bring to the table. So Abraham Lincoln is thinking, okay, how do I get more votes? I will invite in a Democrat. I will invite in maybe someone from the South, trying to show those both sides, right? Trying to show that he is going to be in the middle. So keep that in mind. But now the grief after Lincoln's death is so absolutely enormous. And we see you have the South pretty scared of what their fate is going to be without Lincoln's compassionate leadership that really pushed this amnesty and this forgiveness. And Johnson really majorly clashes with Congress. Johnson comes in and he's like, oh, you know what? This is going to be an even more lenient plan for the South. And he is also going to really punish the wealthy Southern planter class, meaning those people who own plantations. Because Johnson, as far as someone who came from the South and knows the system, something that's very important to remember, he grew up really poor. So he grew up with this chip on his shoulder about how the wealthy class always had more than he did. So keep this in mind as well. But it says, guess what? All states need to do is repeal secession, abolish slavery, and refuse to pay Confederate debts, and then they're totally fine. So what happens next is going to be this big tug-of-war between Johnson and Congress. And again, we said in class, there's no handbook on this. How do you sew a country back together again? What do you do after a civil war? We have no idea. So they're going to be fighting who's in control of Reconstruction, the president or Congress. And eventually we're going to see Congress take it back, but this is about when Johnson is in power. So historians refer to Johnson being in power as, quote, business as usual. And the subtext of that is that the South has not changed all that much. He is going to really put Confederates back into power, and he is going to make it very clear that the whites are in control of Southern Reconstruction, and these are the same people that were, just fighting against Union troops, so this is going to come with a great deal of controversy. And it's important to remember as we talk about this too, not only Johnson's economic background and things like that, but he is just a huge white supremacist. That is kind of his MO for most of his decisions. So again, we have the majority of Southern whites who already have this historic superiority to Black people, right? And now there's this intense prejudice of freedmen because freedmen are walking examples of the fact that you lost your entire way of life and that you lost this war, right? And this is going to plant, again, just this really nasty, deep-seated hatred and racism that's going to continue for years to come. And most Southerners can't fathom at this time in 1865 that whole world since 1619, that relationship of the slave owner and the slave is now to be replaced by equality and citizenship for African Americans. They just can't really wrap their heads around it. And in some ways, we know as a country, we're still having trouble with that, right? So how is this white power upheld? How does Johnson see it upheld? Through the government. Civil War vets, Confederates, everybody reelected back into Congress, back into local governments. And imagine that first day back in Congress, these guys you fought against who might have killed people that you loved and on both sides. And now just those seats have always been empty in Congress with the Confederates. Now they're just back in. They just took their seats. As you can imagine, those first meetings, very, very wrought with tension. And two, Johnson just really pardons almost everyone. He's going to pardon most of the Confederates. And now they're just back in power, right? They're back being mayors, they're back being congressmen, they're back in all these places. And what the South wants is a South that is close as possible to life before the Civil War. And that's what they're going to try to create. They want to retain that way of life. So how do they do this? With something called the Black Codes. So when we talk about the Black Codes, I want you to think about them as an early version of Jim Crow laws. The Black Codes are going to be in the South's wish to stay the same, with the 13th Amendment, how do we make this work? They're going to say, okay, we're going to enforce slave-like conditions, and we are going to ensure that the wealthy planter class still has that cheap black labor. And they are going to pass the black codes to make that happen. This is the beginning of the South. Well, not the beginning, because we've seen examples of it in the past, but it's the start of the South really barring federal laws, such as the 13th Amendment, later on 14th, 15th, with extremely prejudicial local and state ones. And we're going to see that continue into 1950s, 1960s, right? And that's what the civil rights movement is going to be all about fighting. So how do you do this? You make sure that slaves, ex-slaves, now cannot be independent. And that independence, as important as it is to have social independence, you need economic independence. If you don't have economic independence first, those social things cannot change because you're still depending on somebody else for your paycheck and basically your livelihood, right? So all the things that would give African Americans independence economically, starting your own business, doing all these different things, the black codes make them impossible. So the black codes are going to vary by state, but they're going to say things like, yes, African Americans can marry, they can own property, they can have all these things, but then there's that like fine print, you know what I mean? And think about it like those commercials that promise you like lower blood pressure, you're going to lose weight, you're going to be fantastic, everything. And in the very last few seconds of the commercial, it's like, you may die from all these causes and lose your limbs and blah, 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 right? So that's kind of what the black codes are. Like in the big block print, it says like, oh yeah, African Americans and ex-slaves have all these different rights, but it says that you cannot open your own businesses, you cannot rent property in towns or cities. They'll say, sure, you can hunt, but you can't use hunting dogs and you can't use a gun. So then I'm sorry, how are you going to hunt? Are you going to try to just like stalk wild animals and kill them with your hands, right? So this doesn't really make sense. It's going to say you cannot choose your own line of work. And then often too, you're not going to get a job because you're black and it's the South post-Civil War. So then you can get arrested for being jobless if you don't have a job. And it says you cannot break a contract with one employer unless you produce a certain amount. You can't quit one and be hired by the next. There's all these different job restrictions. It's basically going to leave free blacks with no choice. You're going to be tenant farming and you're going to be sharecropping, right? Because owning your own business, doing all these other things are impossibilities because of the black codes. Again, these local and state laws. And again, it's to keep that inequality firmly in place, social inequality, political inequality, and especially economic inequality, because that's really the nut of it, right? So we know that this war has taken a toll on Southern morality and pride and everything else. But I want you to think about Germany after World War II, right? Germany after World War II is going to have all kinds of these vaunted ex-military guys who now have lost so much money, do not have jobs, and have taken a huge, huge hit as far as their ego and their pride, right? And they were used to being treated like they were the head of everything, and they were seen as glorious, and they were seen as somebody who, had everything going on, and now they are home, they don't have money. This is going to bring up all kinds of feelings of emasculation and bitterness, and we're seeing this in lots of respects with ex-Confederate war generals and colonels and all of this. They are going to be in the local government again, as we said, but life is not going to be as it was for them, and there's going to be a lot of anger from this, a ton of anger, and they are dead set on keeping that old way of life. So now, because you have these people in power, what's going to happen? You're going to see hate crime groups like the KKK, all of this come about, and really like no repercussion. And these are hate crimes. We are talking about people's homes being invaded who are African American, people beaten, people, their property seized, and of course people outright killed, murder happening, and no justice being served for it. And the KKK is one of many private terrorist groups that are going to form in the name of that Old South and Confederacy to basically just terrorize African Americans and commit these acts of violence, and they are rarely going to be prosecuted for it. So you're rarely going to answer to the local government for your actions, and that's because so much of your local government is also in this organization. And when we look at a situation like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Who's going to speak out? Who's going to risk their own lives? We talk about this with the Salem witch trials. Who's going to say, but she's not a witch because then the finger's pointed at you and you are next, right? So you see this, and so many people in law enforcement are also going to be in the KKK, etc. And even if you're not connected, you ignore it because you're worried about your own house, your own family, whether you're black or white, right? So it's just petrifying that we see this continue and we see this persist, right? And also that these groups, many of them still physically exist today and have quite a big membership. So all in all, African Americans are the target of these hate crimes. They have no protection under the law. They have no protection from police, law enforcement, or from the court system. So clearly, this is not good, right? This is not supposed to be the point of Reconstruction. This is not Lincoln's vision for sure. But Lincoln isn't here. And this is Andrew Johnson's plan, and it's this business as usual. But who's going to step in? Congress is going to step in. Once again, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, these guys who are radical Republicans, hyper abolitionist guys before the Civil War that now are going to be all about freedmen's rights after the Civil War, and unfortunately too all about punishing the South for what they have deemed was their war that they started. So the North starts to react to these black codes, to this spirit of secession that still seems to be very alive and well in the South. And again, I would love to tell you that Northerners truly cared about freedmen rights and black people and African Americans at this time. They do not. They just really dislike that the South is being disobedient, that the South isn't acting like someone who lost, that they're not acting remorseful. So they react. And this is where your big radical Republicans and those liberals push back. They want economic opportunity for freedmen. They want political equality. They want a more thorough reconstruction of the South, and they want to be in charge of it as well. So when we talk in class, we're going to talk about two different bills. They have the Freedmen Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act is really going to be like the bones of the 14th Amendment. And we're going to discuss how that really defines citizenship and how so much of what they do is so incredible. But again, change needs to be sustainable and it needs to last. And you can do phenomenal things in an instant, but you don't have a foundation of that staying, then what's the real point of that change if it's not going to continue to give to its future, right? And unfortunately, so much good happens during radical Reconstruction, but it does not stick around. And that's going to be one of the main issues we discuss in class. So that's it, guys, our little catch up for Reconstruction. We will pick up again with when radical Reconstruction happens, and I will see you then.